So Dr. Paul Pritchard is joining us next. Now, Paul, I saw carbon credits mentioned once in Michael's slides there. Now, I know that you have your thoughts with regards to planting trees, etc. But he's thinking, yes, maybe. But Paul, do you want to introduce yourself and then perhaps give us an overview with regards to, okay, what is changing in the world of finance, especially with regards to sustainability, climate change, etc. at the moment?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And yes, I was listening with interest to Michael about talking about the broader ESG and did notice the carbon credits bit. My background, as Sarah's mentioned, is very much in the finance sector, a lot around due diligence. So I was originally an environmental person, and it covered asset management and insurance primarily, particularly around risk management, but I've also been involved with banking and venture capital to some degree as well. And what I'm actually going to talk about, I think does relate in many ways to the issues that Michael was raising, but also I think the other issues that you've already been thinking about earlier around ESG issues, around just transition issues. It is approaching it from a slightly different direction. So I think I would see this as complementary rather than something that's more of the same. It's actually coming at it from a slightly different approach. And I suppose one thing to say, which I don't know if it's surprising or not, is that probably the mining sector hasn't been a particular focus for the finance sector until now. I think there is a historical interest, particularly from the ESG community, and particularly about license to operate and those sorts of aspects. But actually in a lot of the initiatives that have been appearing over the last few years, the focus has been very much on other sectors, particularly those associated with climate change and very high or high proportion of greenhouse gas emissions. And so those sectors, those industries, I think are already in the debate, and they're already arguing their case for we should get this treatment or that treatment. And I suppose in some ways what I'm going to say is if mining wants to be part of that and wants to be treated appropriately, it actually needs to get to the table and understand what's been discussed in the finance sector and what the potential implications are. And the other thing where the initiatives that I'm going to talk a little bit about differ, I think, from lots of ESG or just transition or stakeholder kind of initiatives to date, is that a lot of this has actually come from within the finance sector itself and is actually concerned with from the sort of national banks, the international regulators around banking and insurance. And the concern has come about the impacts of sustainability, climate change in the first instance, but broader sustainability as well, the impacts that climate change would have on the financial system, on the global financial system. And look, the first step, of course, is that is saying, well, the banks, insurers, investors themselves, their own operations are not particularly impactful, typically small offices. So it's very clear very quickly that the major financial risks associated with sustainability to the finance sector sit within the people that they lend money to, that they invest in, and that they insure. So that's the first thing that, and it was kind of a big step, I suppose, for the sector in starting to say, we need to understand what's going on within our client portfolios. And about 5 years ago, the first major initiative in this came out of the Financial Stability Board. which was set up after the financial crash to look at these sorts of issues. And they came up with a set of recommendations called TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And we're really just starting to see the finance sector getting to grip with what they actually mean and what information they actually need from their clients and how that might impact things going forward. And I'll get onto that in a little while. But I suppose that there are two main areas to this. So first of all, and I think both areas have actually come up in the conversation this morning, and I'm sure yesterday as well. The first is that if we think about climate change, where the initial focus has been, there are very obviously risks to organization looking forward associated with climate change, and typically associated with greenhouse gas emissions with their own operations. So there needs to be an understanding, or the finance sector needs to understand what's happening in terms of emissions from the organizations that they work with and finance. So that's one side. That's the kind of risk side, or one element of the risk side. And the other is, of course, that climate change has physical impacts. It changes extreme weather, flooding, drought, and so on. That also has an impact on organizations, and the bank, the insurers, and the investors want to understand that. Is this going to threaten a particular business operating in a certain location? Is it going to threaten it financially? So there's a need to get the information to facilitate that. The other side of the coin, which has come up, is that the transition to a low carbon economy, to a sustainable economy, requires that certain industries develop, that there are innovations and so on. And I think it's that opportunity side as well, which probably hasn't been focused on so much, but I think is particularly relevant to the mining sector. And if we're thinking about these conversations with the finance sector, then both sides need to be addressed. So it's the sector needs to think about, what are we doing about our own transition to a sustainable economy? And that includes just transition as well as greenhouse gas emissions and impacts on nature and so on. So have we got a clear pathway for our individual organization or for our sector so that it aligns with what we want to see in future? And that can be pretty challenging in itself. And the other side is, actually, because of all the policy decisions and all the changes that are going to be made, and the need for electrification and so on, and the need for battery storage and renewable generation, all this, what industries are actually going to have significant opportunities arising out of that transition? So it's the two sides of it there. And as with any transition, there are going to be financial winners and losers, and losers and winners within the sector as well. So certain sectors will be adversely affected for sure. And I think, again, a lot of the focus in the finance sector is concerned around coal mining. And for good or bad, mining in many people's minds in the finance sector is associated with coal mining. So it kind of fits there. So I think there needs to be an understanding that these are very different types of industry, and that it isn't just one sector with all the same characteristics. And going sort of further than that, looking at the individual sector, there will be organizations, just like Michael was saying, there are some organizations that are on top of this and understand this and can provide information and addressing these issues, and that's great. And these initiatives like TCFD should be hugely beneficial to those organizations, because one of the key risks, well, there are two types of primary risk, if I put it like that. The physical risks associated with climate change. So they're saying that's the extreme weather and everything else, and how organizations prepare for that and how mines prepare for it. What happens if there's restrictions on water? What happens if there's increased flood risk? Those sorts of physical risks. But probably nearer term, there are water term transition risks, which would be around legal changes. And I think as well, particularly important, the risk of financial institutions being subject to legal action for not doing what they say they're doing, and also reputational aspects with customers, stakeholders expressing concerns about financing certain practices. So what we're seeing now is the kind of understanding of how these schemes might operate within the finance sector. And there are particularly technical challenges associated with how they look at these things. And then that should drive better disclosure around these issues. And this is me being positive and optimistic, assuming it works properly, that we should see better disclosure around that. And following on from that, recognition of the good players as being the ones that have access to finance or preferable access to finance, and disfavoring the ones that don't meet the criteria that we want to see associated with the transition to sustainability. So I think it can be really powerful, and we're seeing TCFD become mandatory in a number of countries, and the US has also just kind of joined the group, and it's the SEC in the US is actually just publishing guidelines on this. It doesn't use the word TCFD in there, but it is TCFD in all but name. So there are the particular technical challenges around this, and I know a lot of organizations will be already facing requests from investors for ESG information and disclosure and questionnaires and all that. And this this sort of newer or developing area of challenge is probably going to add to that in some ways. And it's going to pose slightly different challenges, because these are not necessarily just about the impacts on the environment and on the local community and how certain issues are being managed, but it's actually about the internal strategy of the mining organization, and what's the business plan look like, and is it robust enough to deal with the sorts of changes that are coming further down the line, and not just within a sort of 1 to 5 year timescale, which would be normal to finance. I know mining thinks longer term than that, but this is probably looking over periods of decades. With the net zero 2050 is the sort of talking point, I suppose, the major talking point now. But as part of that, there's also what's happening by 2030. And targets for greenhouse gas reduction, protection of nature, and so on. The social issues, which I know, again, I've been talking about a lot today, are in there. They're not as prominent as climate and nature, but they are in there. And I think everyone's expecting those to rise in prominence. It's fair to say climate has been the primary focus, partly because it's probably easier to measure and easier to put a financial value on. So I think that's probably the main reason why that's first. Of course, it is a critical issue that we need to address quickly. So if we're thinking about the sorts of challenges that are going to come out of this to the sector, absolutely for sure, it's going to be about disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. And that certainly covers operational sites, but one of the key things that it does cover is beyond operational sites. So what about in the materials and things that are sitting in the supply chain and downstream as well? So there's going to be a look at an interest in the whole value chain, and I suppose that links in quite closely to the idea of where are materials coming from. And you might be dealing with a large company, but actually is it getting things from smaller scale, less transparent, whatever sources? So I think that there will be pressure to get that transparency along the value chain, particularly in certain terms of greenhouse gas impacts in the first case, but more widely around nature and social issues going forward. And with those sorts of impacts, the next step is really how those impacts are going to change over time and how they relate to the strategy, business strategy of the organization. So we know for sure that the sector is going to be involved in net zero, and that's sort of 50% of the conversations that I hear now is net zero by 2050, and how are particular sectors going to get there? Net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So that for sure is going to come up in conversations in what's your plan as an organization to achieve net zero with interim targets at 2030 around that. So that relates to own impact. The other side of the coin, again, which has come out today, is what is it you're actually producing and what do you plan to produce, and how does this, how is the market for this likely to develop in the context of net zero pledges and actions by government over decarbonisation, electrification, and so on. And I think that, again, it's kind of been raised earlier, but I don't know if it's been pushed strongly enough, if I put it like that, that actually a lot of the materials that have been produced are critical to the transition, and assuming the impacts are managed, the operational impacts are managed, what are the opportunities around this? And two of the challenges are, firstly, that this involves looking forward over periods of decades with masses of uncertainty over things like the actual physical impacts associated with climate change, but also the policy environment that this happens within. So there's a lot of discussion about a very significant increase in carbon prices, and that being used as a mechanism to drive the transition. So one of the things will be, what happens if the price of carbon goes up to $200, $300, $400 a ton, for example? How does that affect your business? And are you resilient to it? And can you accommodate it? So I think that those sorts of questions fit into the sorts of approaches that people are applying, so most typically termed scenario analysis. So people look at different futures and say, how would our business look under this future? And what does that imply? And what do we need to do now to think about where we want our business to be in 2030 and 2040 and 2050 and so on? So that's pretty new. It's actually not new to all sectors, but it's pretty new in many ways to the finance sector, and they're just kind of getting their head around it. But they will be pushing organizations to actually do these sorts of exercises so they can understand how they're positioned. Following on from that, we also have the developments of auditing and accounting standards. And I suppose one positive thing about this, in an area where we're getting multiple standards and lots of organizations coming out with initiatives and net zero, race to zero, finance alliance for net zero. So you can choose lots and lots of initiatives, and new ones appearing every day. It does feel like we're starting to get some consolidation in this space, whereby the finance sector is working with the regulators, is working with the auditors to get some consistency over measurement and disclosure. In the first case, this is very much climate related, so it's about greenhouse gas emissions and resilience and action and research and development and involvement in activities that will support the transition. So it's kind of in that space. Coming down the line, pretty closely afterwards, are the related TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And again, I think this will be resonate very strongly with the sector, given the sorts of the nature of operations and the location of operations and the environmental sensitivity of many of the operations, that this is actually looking at dependencies on nature provided services and then links into things like biodiversity as well. And I will actually say a little bit about carbon credits, because that is a part of the whole picture. So carbon credits and the idea of getting credits or offsetting for planting trees, if I put it at its most basic, a number of years ago kind of received a lot of criticism. And I think there's a lot of concern around that. And there was a kind of move away from saying, you know, we really shouldn't be doing this. It's actually come back into the agenda much more. And I think there is the compliance market kind of operates at the national level, with countries saying, you know, we want to finance certain activities such as afforestation to generate the credits that we need to meet our own internal targets. But I think interestingly as well, developments at the kind of corporate and voluntary credit or voluntary market level, whereby it's been seen increasingly as a good thing that organizations get involved with and start to invest in areas that are maybe outside of their direct scope of activity. So this could be any organization, and actually start to support activities that improve carbon sinks and avoid deforestation and support reforestation as well. So it's actually a really interesting time from looking at the risk and the opportunity, but also looking at the development in the voluntary carbon markets, with the appetite to actually support these going forward. Again, the critical thing in my view is about the good governance, transparency and disclosure. And overall, I will actually stop in a minute. Sarah hasn't stopped me yet, and sometimes when I go on, yeah, you do, but this one appropriately. So I think the key things that I would take from this are that TCFD and related initiatives are happening. This isn't at the discretion of individual banks, insurers, investors deciding that they want to be more active. They're being required to do it by national and international regulators. So it's going to happen. And it's going to tear down to the challenge to the people, to their clients, and that preparation for that is going to be helpful. And the result is going to be that within sector, there are going to be those organizations that are well prepared for this and have the right data and are going to benefit from it, and they're going to benefit from improved access to finance and so on, and investment. And there are going to be those that suffer from it bluntly, that can't meet the requirements. And transparency actually will be a key concern, because if you don't have the data and you can't understand it and you haven't assessed your business model, then that's a risk in itself, and not least a reputation risk, so which is a current risk as well as thinking forward. So I think a lot of these things look slightly abstract and one step removed, and in a sense they are, but actually they're coming down the line, and they're going to be really important, and they should complement the sorts of sector-driven initiatives and ESG initiatives that we've been talking about. So I'm actually going to stop there, and I don't know if there's prompted any questions or commented that.
So I think with regards to that Paul, it's always absolutely fantastic to hear you talk about all of this, because there's so much change that's been going on in that world of finance, and the thing is that it's here to stay. We have to do it. It's been driven with regards to, say, the financial impacts. We know there are broader impacts with regards to that, and actually I'm going to just go straight to our next speaker, Paul, and let us take those questions just into the chat, just in the interest of time. But one thing I would mention there that I think was really interesting was that mining at the moment isn't at the table with regards to all of this, despite the fact that it's mining that is going to be providing the vast majority of the materials needed for the energy transition. And also, depending on how we mine, we generally create huge volumes of emissions, and then beyond that into the potential impact on nature, the potential impact on communities, etc. That is absolutely huge for all of us. So I think this is something here, and obviously we've been speaking with a number of different organizations over the last year or so. At present, mining isn't even at the table where we need to engage with discussion. And I think that that's something where we need to work with the world of finance. We need to work with all of those other individuals who hold the pen on things like climate change, et cetera, to make sure that as an industry, both including large scale mining and artisanal and small scale mining, all of us, we're actually considered in that. So awesome. Thank you so much for that, Paul.